known as dark reactions. We don't call them those anymore because while no light is needed, it can happen in dark or in light. And they used to be called dark reactions because they can happen in the dark, but they can. It's a little deceiving to call them dark reactions because they can also happen in the light, in the presence of light. Um, but light is not required. And really, there's only one step, and we refer to that as the Calvin cycle. So often, the light independent reaction is just simply known as the Calvin cycle. So, this is the second phase of photosynthesis. So, it takes place in the stroma, which is the space or fluid between the thylakoid membrane. And it's kind of that fluidy space. It uses NADPH and ATP, which, as you recall, those were products of the light dependent reaction. So those were produced, this is the light dependent reaction right here. And they were produced, as you can see, they're produced ATP, NADPH. They're produced in that reaction and they're needed for the Calvin cycle. It also needs CO2 for this. And so you'll see that right here, there's the CO2 that gets entered in to this reaction. So we have ATP from the light dependent reaction and NADPH from the light dependent reaction and also CO2. And the main product of this is this down here, this sugar, which we know of as glucose. So basically it functions kind of like this sugar factory, which its main goal or objective is to produce this sugar. And it also, what's interesting is it regenerates the starting material with every time it goes around the turn. So it has these three phases of the Calvin cycle, 1, 2, and 3. And in the end, it's still producing some of the same things that it needs. So as you can see, this ribulose is produced, and it's the kind of the start. So the light independent reaction, the inputs are ATP, NADPH, and CO2. And the main output is glucose. So now we're going to talk about the initial stages of the light independent reaction. Again, we'll review that a little bit in order to understand alternate pathways. And we'll also talk about these C4 and CAM plants. So in the stomata, this is where the gas exchange occurs. So you'll see the CO2 entering in, and we see oxygen and water can also be given off. You might say, well, isn't water needed for photosynthesis? Yes, but plants can take in water and they can also release water. And so they can release water through their stomata, which is right here. This little opening, and it can open or close. These are two guard cells. That's one guard cell. And they can open or close to allow this gases through. So again, they take in CO2, they release oxygen as waste, and then water can also be lost kind of by what's called an accident. Plants don't really want to lose water, but anytime they open up these the stomata, water can be lost, and so that's kind of an accident when that occurs. So something called photorespiration occurs, which is when water is lost through the evaporation. And that's when the stomata is open. So when the stomata is open, uh, just like if I pour water out on a hot day, it evaporates out. Well, if the plant cell has the stomata open, then water can be lost through evaporation, which is bad. Because remember, plant cells want to be quite full with water. They don't want to be losing water. So C3 plants, these are our normal, typical plants. They do not have any adaptation. So every time they open their stomata, they're losing water. And so this is just normal photosynthesis. But there are some plants that have formed an alternate pathway. And so they can limit light and water, can limit the amount of photosynthesis a plant can perform. And some plants develop these alternate pathways to maximize energy and also conserve the water loss. So they want to open their stomata only at certain times, so to speak, so that they can still get the CO2, which is the energy they need. So they need CO2, they need CO2 for photosynthesis. But they want to conserve the water and not lose water. So they kind of have a dilemma as when do they open the stomata to maximize getting CO2 and yet only open it where they're not going to be, when they will lose the least amount of water. So we have what's called C4 plants. And these plants minimize water loss. And how they do that is they turn the CO2 into what's called a 4-carbon molecule instead of a 3-carbon molecule. And this allows them to have the CO2 kind of like kept in place for when they need it, which means they can keep their stomata closed during hot days. And they can still be undergoing photosynthesis because they have that 4-carbon molecule. They turn the CO2, they collected the CO2 into that 4-carbon molecule, and they can use that at other times. So they can still be undergoing photosynthesis, yet keep their stomata closed to minimize water loss. An example of that is corn and sugarcane. Camp plants are a little bit different. These occur in water-conserving plants that live in deserts and other really arid environments. The stomata is really always closed during the day, and so they've evolved to just never open their stomata during the day. And so the only time that they can get CO2 is at night. And so this turns into like a storage molecule until daytime. Examples are orchids, cactus, and pineapples. So C3 plants, these are our typical normal plants. Their stomata is open during the day and they live in cool, wet environments. C4 plants can still open it during the day. They will live in hot, sunny environments, but they can also close during day if needed. Camp plants, they are never open during the day, only at night, and they're in very hot, dry environments.